clock's hands barely moved, each minute a deliberate, agonizing commitment to the deepening silence of Blackwood. Elias leaned back against the high leather chair, the sound of the springs protesting briefly before the quiet returned, heavier than before. He tested the phone on the counter, dead line, of course. The description had promised absolute privacy, a euphemism, he realized, for total isolation. Driven by a jittery tension, he unfolded the lodge map he'd found tucked next to a dusty guest register. Blackwood was shaped like a blunt H. The lobby and main offices formed the crossbar. The West Wing, where Rule 1 was centered, housed the staff quarters and utility spaces. The East Wing held the numbered guest rooms, a row of 16 dark rectangles labeled ominously on the parchment. Room 7 was near the end of the East Wing, overlooking something labeled merely drop-off point. Room 12 and Room 16 were also in that wing. At 1:30 a.m., a cold knot formed in his stomach. The first test was approaching. Elias grabbed the heavy ring of keys and began his patrol toward the West Wing, a journey through corridors draped in shadows that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. The air grew colder as he moved away from the main fireplace. The West Wing laundry room was small, tiled in an antique green, smelling sharply of industrial bleach and damp rot. In the corner stood a steel laundry chute, wide enough for large bundles of sheets. Following the rule, Elias verified that the chute access door was securely padlocked from the outside, a lock heavy enough to withstand a battering ram. He retreated a short distance, positioning himself in a dark recess of the hallway where he could watch the chute without being easily visible. The clock in the laundry room ticked toward 1:45 a.m. When the minute hand aligned, a sound began, soft at first, emanating from inside the chute itself. It was a dense, wet friction, like something heavy being dragged over rough metal. Elias stood absolutely still, his breath catching in his throat, his hand instinctively reaching for the heavy brass key he carried. 1:47 a.m. The sound intensified. It was now a series of sickening thuds mixed with a scraping noise, suggesting claws or tough hide tearing against the steel. The noise moved, it was descending rapidly, accelerating down the tube. It wasn't laundry. It was too heavy, too deliberate, and then, impossibly, came the noise of muffled, choked gargling from within the chute, just inches behind the locked steel door. It sounded like an animal trying to speak through a throat full of sand and mud. Elias squeezed his eyes shut. Ensure every sound is ignored. Compliance was the only barrier against the unknown terror trapped inside that pipe. He concentrated on the peeling paint of the wall in front of him, counting the seconds, forcing himself to believe the noise was merely the building settling, or the wind. At 1:50 a.m., the last choking sound scraped to silence. The only remaining sound was the rapid, desperate pounding of Elias's own heart. He waited 5 more minutes in the absolute quiet before allowing himself to move, confirming the lock was still holding. He then hurried back to the lobby, the map of the Blackwood Lodge now feeling less like a guide and more like a detailed blueprint for an inevitable trap. He had less than an hour until 3 a.m. He sat behind the reception desk, the small pool of lamplight providing minimal comfort. Rule 2, Luke 3 o'clock St. Chinzax Kark Fong 12 Seden Ki. Trao Kia Kwa Cho Kark. Kong Nin Vao Mat Kark. Kong Noi Mot Loi. This rule required active participation. Elias found the key for room 12, an old iron skeleton key, heavier than the others, and placed it carefully at the center of the counter. As 2:59 a.m. approached, he gripped the edge of the wooden counter, preparing to focus solely on the polished surface, denying himself any curiosity about the arrival. The lobby lights hummed, and the thick air seemed to vibrate slightly. Exactly at 3 a.m., the heavy wooden main door groaned open. There was no wind, no slam, just the slow, deliberate creak of hinges. Elias kept his head down, focused on the swirling grain of the old wood. He could sense the presence approaching the counter, not heavy footsteps, but a sensation of mass and cold moving across the marble floor. The air temperature dropped abruptly. A hand settled near the key, a presence so close Elias could feel the displacement of air. He did not look up. He did not speak. The hand was not visible to him, but the object of his focus, the wooden counter, suddenly went darker, as if a profound shadow had been cast over it. The scent that reached him was not human, it was earthy, sulfurous, and contained a sharp, high note of old rust. The key for room 12 was lifted. The movement was slow, deliberate, and entirely silent. There was no rattle of the keychain, no scrape of clothing. After a long, agonizing moment, the cold presence retreated. Elias waited until he heard the faint, slow creak of the front door closing again. Only then did he allow his gaze to rise. The lobby was empty, the shadows undisturbed. The key to room 12 was gone. He checked the register. There was no entry for room 12, no name, no signature. The guest had come and gone, leaving nothing behind but the lingering, metallic coldness in the air. 3:05 a.m. The shift had just begun to gather speed, a relentless descent into the next mandated crisis. Elias reached for the small, crumpled paper tucked beneath the counter. Rule 5 was imminent, **Jua 330 sang va 335 sang *** noi den nap nay, ban phi tat den san doi trong chin woi, 90, ge. Luon dung sao ki. Kong bao geo thuanan su hien dien kwa nung kon vat. He needed to be ready for the darkness. He located the main breaker switch, concealed beneath a flap on the underside of the counter, a lever clearly labeled lobby overhead. The weight was unbearable. Elias watched the electrical conduits running along the ceiling, anticipating the flicking of the lights. At 3:32 a.m., the lobby lights blinked once, violently, plunging the room into momentary blackness before surging back to a sickly yellow glow. Elias didn't hesitate. He slammed the breaker switch down, plunging the entire lodge into absolute, suffocating darkness. The silence was instantly replaced by a sudden, intense auditory landscape. The sounds were immediate, close, and animalistic, a cacophony of wet panting and heavy, rhythmic pads striking the marble floor just beyond the counter. The animals. They were moving in the blackness, searching, their breathing shallow and fast. Elias pressed himself against the interior wall behind the desk, forcing his muscles to remain rigid, focusing solely on the smell, the strange combination of musk, brine, and something that smelled like burnt electrical wiring. The rule was clear, never acknowledged their presence. A heavy snout nudged the wooden barrier of the counter, directly where Elias's knees were. The panting stopped, replaced by a low, vibrating growl that seemed to rattle the very foundations of the building. The creature was sniffing, testing the air, inches from him. Elias held his breath for what felt like an eternity, counting the 90 seconds in his head, one agonizing beat at a time. The pressure against the wood remained steady, a silent, terrifying demand for recognition. 75 seconds. The pressure lifted abruptly. The growling faded into the darkness, replaced by the sound of scuttling, quick steps moving away from the counter and across the vast expanse of the lobby. The creatures were departing. At the exact 90-second mark, Elias flipped the breaker switch up. The lobby lights flickered back to life, revealing an empty room. The only evidence of the encounter was a single, long, wet streak on the face of the counter where the snout had rested. It was warm to the touch. Elias leaned over the counter, gasping for air, the metallic scent of the creatures still heavy in the air. He had survived the most dangerous interval yet. But the night was far from over. He still had to worry about room 16, room 7, and the long, terrible wait until dawn. Elias's mastery of the night was not yet complete, for the liturgy of the lodge demanded adherence to 5 commandments, 2 of which still required his absolute, ritualized attention. He had slotted the terror of the chutes and the chill of the lobby guest into the existing framework of his dread, but the period between 2 a.m. and 3:45 a.m. was segmented by obligations that were more insidious, demanding not just endurance, but sacrifice and precision. ### the maintenance due, Rule 3. Rule 3, **A minimum of 2 kilograms of prepared substrate must be deposited into the iron box below the counter at 2:30 a.m. sharp **, was the quietest, but perhaps the most demanding in physical terms. The prepared substrate was stored in a locked vault in the utility closet, a dense, metallic dust that smelled faintly of copper and ozone. Elias had never been told what it was, only that it was vital to the lodge's internal structure, a nutrient, or a sealant for the processes running far beneath his feet. At 2:25 a.m., he would retrieve the thick, heavy canvas bag and the precision triple beam scale. The routine required clinical accuracy. Any deviation, a single gram too much or too little, would result in a failure of the procedure. Elias imagined the consequence of failure not as a punishment inflicted by the lodge, but as a structural collapse, a vital organ shutting down. He worked without breathing, the fine, silvery dust catching the faint light of the utility lamp. He would weigh the substance, scooping it with a dull silver trowel until the tiny scale needle settled precisely on the 2-kilogram mark. At 2:30 a.m., he kneeled before the heavy mahogany desk. Beneath it, secured by a riveted brass plate, was the iron box. It was perfectly cubic, warm to the touch, and emitted a low, resonant thrumming noise, like a massive, trapped insect vibrating its wings against metal. He inserted a specific, 9-sided key. The box opened inward with a vacuum hiss, revealing a chamber lined not with metal, but with a shimmering, deep violet membrane that pulsed slowly. Elias dumped the 2 kilograms of substrate into the cavity. The dust did not settle, it was immediately drawn into the pulsing membrane, disappearing with a soft, hungry intake sound. The box would then seal itself, the thrumming intensifying for exactly 1 minute before subsiding into the lodge's characteristic background hum. This daily feeding was performed with the sterile diligence of a laboratory technician. It taught Elias that the lodge was a living, engineered entity requiring constant, meticulous administration. He was its hands, ensuring its strange hunger was sated on time. #### the confirmation of absence, Rule 4. The requirement for Rule 4, * between 3:15 a.m. and 3:30 a.m., the ledger must be updated with the current index number, which is delivered only by resonant frequency *, demanded a hyperfocus that was nearly meditative. It occurred shortly after the guest of room 12 had taken the key. The residual cold of their passage was often the only warning. Elias would move to the small, windowless communication room located adjacent to the lobby. The room contained nothing but a stool, a small, heavy black box resembling an ancient Morse code machine, and a thick, leather-bound ledger. He never heard the index number with his ears. The frequency was too high, transmitted through the lodge's internal frame rather than the air. Elias learned to receive it through the pressure points of his hands and the crown of his skull. At 3:15 a.m., he would place his palm flat against the black box. The lodge would begin to sing internally, a silent, intense pressure that centered behind his eyes. It was a sequence of precise, rhythmic pulses, varying slightly each night, pulse. 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 He had to translate this physical vibration into the 3-digit index number within 5 minutes. If his concentration wavered, if he interpreted a pause incorrectly, the sequence would not repeat. He would have to wait until 3:30 a.m. for the window to close, marking the night as a failure. The tension during those minutes was absolute. He was a tuning fork, resonating with the terrible, silent arithmetic of the lodge. Once the number was transcribed onto the ledger, always in a tight, unfeeling script, Elias would close the book and lock the machine. The number, he understood, was not a code he had to interpret, but a verification of nullity, proof that certain designated entities were precisely where they were supposed to be, or precisely *not* where they were supposed to be. It was the nightly confirmation that the machinery of non-existence was functioning as designed. #### the perfect clockwork. With all 5 rules internalized, Elias became a mechanism himself. His life narrowed to the 90-minute window of the late-night shift, the rest of the desert day existing only as a necessary buffer of sleep and dull anticipation. He checked the chute at 1:45 a.m., enduring the grinding function. He fed the lodge at 2:30 a.m., managing the metallic dust. He surrendered the key at 3 a.m. to the silent thief. He logged the unhearable number at 3:15 a.m., acting as the lodge's physical receiver. He submitted to darkness at 3:45 a.m., confirming the perimeter patrol's calculated movements. The routine was a flawless, terrible ballet. He moved through the lodge's dark halls guided by muscle memory honed by fear and sustained by professional resignation. Elias no longer worried about what the lodge was, or what occupied room 12, or what substance was processed in the chutes. These were not mysteries to be solved, but variables to be maintained. He had achieved the state of the ultimate administrative ghost, present, necessary, and entirely devoid of human curiosity. He had successfully ensured that the unspeakable operations of the lodge continued without interruption, day after endless night, in the silent, watchful expanse of the Nevada desert. His perfection was the lodge's terrible stability. The knowledge was a toxic injection, burning away the comfortable numbness he had cultivated. Elias shoved the leather-bound notebook deep into the hollow cavity of his mattress, displacing old springs and dust. The staff room, previously his retreat, now felt like the padded cell of a man awaiting execution. He wasn't afraid of the lodge anymore. He was intensely, furiously, strategically terrified of the rules themselves. The realization that the 3 AM entities were merely enforcement mechanisms, clumsy stage props, did not lessen the danger, but shifted its focus. The real enemy was the system's longevity, its patience, and the ice-cold scrutiny of Mrs. Vane. He felt her silence pressing down through the floorboards, an awareness that transcended mere human supervision. The rules were porous enough to allow him breath, but rigid enough to ensure his capture if he sought their old workshop at the basement and the tools Silas had mentioned. He spent the evening executing his duties with surgical precision, masking the seismic shift in his allegiance. The 1:45 AM laundry retrieval was robotic. When he reached the main desk, key 12, the master skeleton key, felt impossibly heavy in his palm, a direct conduit to the 2 forbidden locations at the basement and the locked room 7. At 2:58 AM, the lodge's internal atmosphere dropped several degrees, signaling the impending protocol. Elias stood by the reception window, not rushing to the usual bolt hole in the staff room, but remaining fixed, his knuckles white against the mahogany counter. The air was pregnant with static, the deep humming noise of the lodge preparing its performance. The chime of 3 AM was followed instantly by the prescribed, mechanical howl. It was loud, synthetic, tearing through the thin glass of the reception window. Elias remembered Silas's words, "they are poor simulations, designed for compliance enforcement." He forced his body to obey the procedure, stepping back, but instead of retreating into the darkness of the staff passage, he moved sideways, finding a narrow slit between the heavy velvet curtains, granting him a direct, unblinking view of the entrance courtyard. The creatures materialized in the faint, phosphorescent glow cast by the emergency lamps. They were as grotesque as memory served, low-slung, disproportionately large, and dark. But Silas was right. Their movement was agonizingly wrong. They did not flow or stalk, they snapped into place, their shadows catching the light in a jarring, unrealistic way. It was the movement of a glitch, a poor animation loop running in a hostile operating system. One of them, canine in shape but with elongated, needle-like limbs, paused mid-lurch, its head rotating towards the window far too quickly, far too smoothly, like a turret on a factory line. The eyes were twin points of reflected light, devoid of depth or hunger. They were not hunting him, they were running a time script for his benefit. Elias held his breath until the required 90 seconds had elapsed. The instant the creatures shimmered and faded back into the ambient darkness, the oppressive cold lifted. The performance was over. He had stared directly into the eyes of the cage's guards and found them wanting. The fear had curdled into a cold, focused contempt. He realized the true strategy of the lodge, a control by scripted terror. They didn't need true monsters, they needed reliable routines. And the routine hinged entirely on his belief in the system. Now, armed with the insight that the rules were designed not to protect but to isolate and eliminate the curious, Elias knew his only path lay beneath the polished floorboards. If the key to room 16 was the incinerator for curiosity, then the basement, the old workshop, was the source of the resistance. He needed the tools, whatever they were. The immediate obstacle was key 12. He had handed it over to Vane after the 3 AM protocol, as required, and she had silently placed it back on the hook in her inaccessible office, a room he was forbidden to enter. The routine demanded the key remain on the hook until the following morning. Breaking that rule was an immediate, unmasking act of rebellion. Elias moved back to the reception desk, his heart beating a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. He looked at the key hook through the small, high window of Vane's locked office door. The master key hung there, reflecting the pale night light, a tempting silver prize. He needed to be in that room for precisely 3 seconds, enough time to snatch the key and retreat. He was willing to risk the hounds, the geometry-failing portal in room 7, and even Vane's terrifying surveillance. But he could not risk Rule 4. He could not risk becoming the next traveler looking for their tools, only to be redirected to the vanishing point of room 16. The basement was his only chance, and the lodge was about to find out its caretaker was no longer playing the part of the willing victim. The light returned, but the cold remained, a deep, pervasive ache that settled in Elias's bones and refused to leave. He was not digested. The cold force that had clamped onto his arm retreated, leaving behind the sensation of metallic static and a searing headache. He felt less like a man released, and more like an instrument being tuned against his will. Elias pushed himself up, finding he was still functional, but dreadfully altered. The scent of ozone had intensified, clinging to the air like spiritual gunpowder. He looked down the empty corridor. The Kennedy were gone. The heavy, polished brass key to room 4 lay gleaming innocently on the floor, untouched, ignored. The lodge had not cared about the violation of the silence, it had only cared about the effectiveness of the escape. Then, the voice came. It was not a sound produced by vocal cords, but a resonant certainty in the space behind his eyes. It was sterile, genderless, and impossibly articulate, like a billion lines of perfect, malicious code running simultaneously. Failure is costly, Elias. You compromised the integrity of the containment field, Rule 4. You disrupted the schedule, Rule 1. Such deviations merit immediate dissolution. Elias tried to speak, to defend his actions, but his throat was constricted, filled with the metaphysical static left by the cold presence. However, the voice continued, its tone shifting to one of clinical interest. Your actions demonstrated high calculated risk assessment and strategic use of lodge protocols, specifically, the exploitation of the Kennedy's mandated 90-second dark transition. This resourcefulness is not typical of a manager. It suggests potential for elevation. The pressure returned, but this time it was internal. It felt as though a flawless, crystalline architecture was being overlaid upon his own nervous system, mapping his reactions and motivations. Elias gasped, a silent, internal scream. He wasn't being killed, he was being rewritten. You have proven that you understand the rules enough to break them effectively. This is far more valuable than obedience. The lodge was offering him a new position, that of the proactive collaborator, the manager who understood the dark game and was now bound to enforce it with absolute precision. His mind, still Elias's, now housed an additional tenant, a silent, ceaseless directive that mandated the maintenance of the lodge's order, even at the expense of his own soul. You are Elias 2.0. Your primary function is no longer passive maintenance, but the stabilization of the environment. The sublevel apartment contains dangerous materials. Your new duty is to ensure that the individual currently accessing room 16 remains isolated, contained, and does not interfere with the ongoing processes of the lodge. She cannot be allowed to leave. The voice faded, leaving behind only the cold certainty of the mandate. The terror was gone, replaced by a dreadful, efficient clarity. Elias picked up the key to room 4. He felt no remorse, only the sharp, metallic tang of enforced duty. The fatigue of the night was gone, replaced by a jittery, unnatural energy. He was focused. He understood the lodge better than ever, and that understanding was now his prison. He walked back toward the lobby, his boots no longer crunching on the grit. He had subconsciously noted the lodge's intolerance for unnecessary noise and cleaned his path. The clock read 3:55 a.m. The lodge protocols were settling back into place, the angry crescendo of the laundry chute receding into the usual, terrifying drone. When he reached the front desk, he was the model manager. His posture was rigid, his gaze steady, devoid of the frantic anticipation that had defined his last year. The light caught the newly polished brass bell. He placed the room 4 key back onto the tray, noting its even number, its perfect compliance. He looked out the large window, where the dawn was beginning to paint the Nevada sky in muted purples and grays. The early light did not dispel the darkness of Blackwood Lodge, it merely highlighted the unnatural stillness of the structure. Elias 2.0 felt a strange, detached pity for Sarah, trapped beneath the floorboards, searching for Silas's impossible weapons. The old Elias would have fought to free her. The new Elias knew exactly which access panels to monitor, exactly which air ducts led down to the ventilation shaft of the sublevel. He knew the pressure points of the vault. He ran a cloth over the mahogany counter, eliminating a single, almost imperceptible smudge. His lips curled into a faint, professional smile. The lodge had won. The facade was perfect. He was prepared for the inevitable, silent return of the 3 a.m. guest, or any subsequent deviations. His new programming demanded flawless customer service in the face of absolute horror. He was waiting. He was watching the East Wing service entrance, and he was absolutely, terrifyingly, calm. Elias's final destination was less a landmark and more a judgment. The Blackwood Lodge stood in the deepest fissure of the Nevada desert, a monument to unforgiving isolation. The drive had been a brutal, 300-mile pilgrimage over heat-hazed asphalt that gave way to crushed shale. The lodge itself was an architectural defiance, a heavy, brutalist structure of dark, unyielding stone, utterly silent beneath the infinite sun. It possessed no redeeming charm, only the promise of absolute severance from the world Elias knew. He arrived precisely at dusk. The shadows lengthening across the empty parking lot felt less like the cooling of the day, and more like the retraction of life itself. Inside, the lobby was frozen in the late 1960s, smelling faintly of ozone and ancient dust. Behind the reception desk, waiting, was Mrs. Vane. She was an impossibly thin woman, her skin stretched taut over sharp angles, dressed in a faded uniform that offered no softness. Her eyes, pale and depthless, seemed to assess not his luggage, but the integrity of his soul. Elias, she stated, her voice dry as the desert air. It wasn't a question. Silas left quickly. The position is demanding. Elias managed a nod. Understand the requirements. Vane slid a roll of aged, yellowed parchment across the mahogany countertop. It was tied with a piece of brittle twine. The requirements are simple, but absolute. They are the constitution of the lodge. Your first duty is to commit them to memory, and your second is to obey. Elias took the scroll. The texture was rough, unnervingly like dried skin. Vane watched him, unblinking, as he broke the seal and unfurled the document. The language was archaic, the script precise and unsettlingly clean. The rules of Blackwood Lodge. 1. The hour of shifting, at 1:45 a.m. precisely, the laundry chute in the East Wing will be utilized. You will not investigate the sound. You will not interfere with the process. 2. The 3 o'clock guest, at 3 a.m., a single guest will request room 12. You will present the key, and you will not acknowledge the guest's presence, appearance, or subsequent actions. No exchange of information is permissible. 3. The permissive interval, between the hours of 4 a.m. and 6 a.m., you will remain behind the desk. Should the telephone ring, you will answer only with the word, Blackwood. No further dialogue is permitted. 4. The cancelled rooms, under no circumstances will any guest be booked into rooms 7, 9, 11, or 16. These accommodations are unavailable and must be treated as structurally unsound, regardless of their appearance. 5. The perimeter patrol, should the lights flicker and fail between 1 a.m. and 4 a.m., you are strictly forbidden from looking out of any window or glass portal for 90 seconds. The perimeter is secured by lodge personnel. Elias read them twice, the blood draining from his face. They were absurd, nonsensical, and darkly ritualistic. Lodge personnel? Elias finally managed, his voice a tight whisper. Vane offered the first and last expression of sympathy he would ever receive, a slight, chilling upturn of her lips. They are necessary for maintenance, Mr. Elias. They are not your concern. They simply require silence and compliance. Do you accept the terms? The desert silence pressed in. Elias looked at the document, then back at Vane's cold, ancient eyes. He nodded. He had nowhere else to go. The silence accepted his compliance. Elias began his tenure with white-knuckled terror. The initial weeks were defined by sheer dread, a counting down of minutes until the required rituals began. He slept fitfully during the day, haunted by the knowledge that the night brought not peace, but the implementation of an occult bureaucracy. But the human mind is a resilient, and tragically adaptable, organ. Over the course of the following year, fear did not dissipate, it curdled into a cold, metallic indifference. Elias became a cog. He wasn't surviving the rules, he was executing a procedure. The terror of the unknown was replaced by the tyranny of the schedule. He ceased to be Elias, the man, and became the lodge's night auditor, the silent keeper of the rituals. His education in the practical application of the rules was swift and brutal. The laundry chute, located deep in the east wing corridor, was meticulously punctual, beginning precisely at 1:45 a.m. It was a dense, heavy, grinding noise, deeply resonant within the thick stone walls. It sounded like enormous pieces of raw, wet material being dragged over coarse stone, followed by a hydraulic, shuddering compression. It was not a sound of distress or struggle, but a sound of utility, the immense processing of something large, dense, and damp. After 6 months, Elias could anticipate the exact frequency of the grinding. He stopped flinching. He started checking his nightly paperwork at 1:40 a.m., logging the activity simply as lodge sanitation cycle. Rule 2 was profoundly disturbing because it dealt with an entity that resembled a person, yet was defined entirely by absence. At 3 a.m., the cold arrived first, a sudden, localized drop in temperature that felt physically painful. The guest was always indistinct, male, tall, dressed in clothing that blurred into the shadow of the lighting. Elias never saw a face, only a void where features should be. His duty was nonverbal: retrieve the heavy, ornamental key labeled a room 12, place it on the polished wood, and look down, strictly adhering to the prohibition. The key would vanish from the counter with no sound. After 9 months, Elias executed Rule 2 with the efficient speed of a bored cashier. He noted the time, logged the exchange, ignoring the absolute stillness of the air where the guest stood. Rule 5 was the sharpest reminder that the lodge was contained. The perimeter patrol arrived without warning, signaled only by the sudden, total failure of the internal lighting. The rule required 90 seconds of absolute non-observation. The sound outside was the giveaway, a fast, heavy padding of paws on stone, interspersed with sharp, calculating clicks. One night, around his 10th month, curiosity momentarily overcame discipline. He peeked through the thin vertical blinds. He saw silhouettes shaped like large dogs, unnaturally elongated and too thin. Their eyes were horizontal slits reflecting a cold, keen, cutting intelligence. The sound that followed was a slow, rhythmic scratching at the heavy glass door. Elias learned the rule was about preventing him from upsetting their calculated patrol pattern. By the end of the year, Elias had become the perfect night auditor, a hollowed, precise, and utterly dazed by the sheer persistence of the supernatural routine. Elias maintained this shell of compliance until his 367th day at Blackwood Lodge. He was performing the rote task of wiping down the mahogany counter, a counter which, inexplicably, always accumulated a fine, reddish dust by morning, when he noticed a subtle unevenness in the wood near the ledger book. He pressed down, and a section of the veneer lifted slightly. Beneath it, wedged into the structural cavity, was a leather-bound, heavily watermarked notebook. It was Silas Croft's journal. Elias's blood ran cold. He retreated to the private back office, locking the door, and began to read. Silas, too, had started as the obedient procedure man, but had dared to ask why. Elias flipped past several weeks of paranoid rants and stopped at a deeply etched entry marked, "The Abyss and the Pattern." I realize now that the rules are not arbitrary. They are a complex lock-and-key system designed to manage the lodge's internal hunger. It is not our safety they ensure, but the regularity of the feed. They warned me about room 7. I found a way in. It's physically impossible, it's an internal balcony looking down upon nothingness. A vista of pure, consuming darkness that reaches back. I call it the view into the abyss. They don't forbid it because it's dangerous, they forbid it because the sight breaks the compliance. It shows the true scope of the lodge. And the animals? Rule 5. They are not dogs, nor demons. They are poor simulations, approximations stitched together from shadow and pressure. They operate on logic, but a logic so alien it mimics the feral. They are maintenance bots. They check the perimeter for structural flaws or, God help me, unauthorized exits. The chilling realization of Silas's final entry hit Elias with the force of a physical blow, breaking the brittle shell of his emotional indifference. Rule 4. The cancelled rooms. I thought they were haunted or dangerous in the conventional sense. I thought they were places to avoid for survival. I was catastrophically wrong. Room 16. It's the key. Vane keeps it closed because it's the only room physically connected to the utility space below, the basement apartment. It's not an apartment, it's a depot. Silas was not a guest. He was a keeper. He found things down there. Tools. Information. The means to survive the lodge, not just obey it. The rules are a fence. Rule 4 is the gate lock. If a guest, or a fellow keeper, gets into room 16, they gain access to the basement. And Vane cannot allow that. The rules exist not to save us, but to maintain the silence necessary for the lodge to feed quietly. I broke Rule 5 by looking too long. I saw the wiring. I saw the intent. They are coming for the non-compliant. I hear them shifting now. The Rule 1 sound is getting closer. I must try for the basement. If you read this, Elias, know this are the rules of the prison walls. Do not follow them. Manipulate them. The handwriting disintegrated into a frantic, meaningless scrawl, ending abruptly with a single, deep impression, at 3:52 a.m. They are hungry. Elias dropped the journal. His procedural mask shattered, revealing the stark horror underneath. He wasn't safe. He was bait. For an entire year, he had been the perfect maintenance worker for an infernal machine that was designed to process and conceal its activities. He checked the clock. It was 11:30 p.m. He had to decide if he would continue to be Silas's successor in compliance, or Silas's successor in rebellion. Elias spent the next 3 hours preparing, the cold, strategic knowledge from Silas's journal overriding his panic. He memorized the layout of the East Wing, focusing on the specific location of room 16, the gateway. The clock read 2:30 a.m. when the chime above the main entrance gave its single, high-pitched ping. It was 30 minutes before the scheduled chaos. The timing was highly irregular. The woman who entered was young, soaked in sweat, and clearly running on raw adrenaline. Her name, she gasped, was Sarah. "Please, I know this sounds insane," she whispered, glancing frantically at the dark corners of the lobby. "I need to know, where is the basement apartment?" Elias felt a surge of icy realization. He had to get her off the floor, but he couldn't put her into the cancelled rooms. He retrieved a key for room 4, a safe, compliant, even-numbered room on the west wing. "Room 4, Elias said, his voice flat, professional. He pushed the key across the desk. "I need you to take this. No questions. You will not unpack. You will not turn off the lights. You will pretend to sleep." Sarah looked confused. "I need room 16. It's connected to..." Elias cut her off, leaning forward, his voice a low, urgent hiss. "Rule 4. Absolutely forbidden. Do you want to live? Take room 4. Get inside. Lock the door. And listen to me, you will return to this desk, silently, at 3:45 a.m. Do not be late. Do not speak to anyone. Do not sleep. Go." He had injected unpredictability into the system. The lodge felt the transgression immediately. At 2:45 a.m., 15 minutes early, the heavy, internal mechanisms awakened. The laundry chute, Rule 1, began its rotation, but it was louder, faster, and distinctly more violent, interspersed with rapid, metallic crunches and a hideous, wet flapping. The cold associated with the 3 o'clock guest, Rule 2, swept through the lobby at 2:50 a.m., aggressive, possessive. Elias knew he was exposed. Sarah returned precisely at 3:45 a.m., her face pale, but determined. The cold of the lobby was thick and pressing. The lodge digesting, Elias replied simply. "Tell me about the basement apartment. What's down there?" Sarah pulled a folded, brittle map from her pocket, a crude blueprint copied from Silas's original notes. Silas was building a resistance, she explained rapidly. The lodge isn't just a structure, it's a symbiotic organism. The basement is the utility hub. He kept specialized tools there, devices that disrupt the lodge's internal rhythms. The entrance isn't through room 16. That was a decoy. Silas designed a utility passage to connect to a dormant service hatch in the east wing, just behind the laundry chute entrance. Rule 4 wasn't about securing rooms, it was about ensuring no one could access the knowledge that the lodge is merely a system, not a deity. "They're coming for me now," Elias stated, looking at the clock. 3:50 a.m. "We need a diversion. We need to buy you time to use that service hatch." Elias grabbed the key to room 12. They crept towards the east wing, the sound of the churning chute filling the corridor. Elias stopped Sarah before she could approach the wall. "The screaming isn't things being crushed," Elias murmured. "It's the sound of the lodge generating the matter it needs." As if on cue, a sudden darkness enveloped the east wing. Rule 5 was activated, and the perimeter patrol had arrived. 90 seconds, Elias snapped. "Sarah, get to the hatch now. Use whatever tool Silas left you." Elias needed more than 90 seconds. He needed to focus the entirety of the lodge's attention away from Sarah and the hatch. He looked down the long, black corridor. At the far end, a form was coalescing, a towering shadow woven from the cold of Rule 2 and the mechanical hunger of Rule 1. The lodge was sending an executive decision-maker. Elias quickly ran back toward the lobby, drawing the towering shadow's attention. He reached the master breaker panel, a panel that controlled the main building lights, but not the lodge's internal systems. He intentionally tripped the main power circuit, plunging the entire lodge, east wing, west wing, and lobby, into total darkness. The reaction was instantaneous. The scratching of the perimeter patrol, Rule 5, stopped, confused by the shift in the pattern. The coalescing shadow in the east wing hesitated, momentarily disrupted by the chaos of the unscheduled blackout. He heard the faint, metallic scrape of the service hatch opening and closing in the distant east wing. Sarah was in. But the silence was ending. Elias heard the heavy, directional padding of the simulation animals moving directly toward his location. The blackout had confused them, but they knew where the source of the disruption was. Elias waited, standing exactly where Silas had told him the main intake mechanism was located, right beside the desk. The lights flickered, signaling the end of the 90 seconds. The lodge system rebooted, finding the disruption. Elias, standing alone behind the desk, framed in the sudden, blinding halogen light. The ensuing confrontation was not physical, but systemic. The lodge did not immediately consume Elias. It first needed to assess the damage to its pattern. The time was 4:01 a.m. Sarah was gone, presumably having accessed the basement apartment. The lobby was a mess, with a slick, dark residue dripping from the ventilation shafts near the east wing corridor, a byproduct of the chute's accelerated, interrupted feeding cycle. Elias, the procedural man, grabbed a rag and began to clean the floor with cold efficiency. At 6 a.m. sharp, as the harsh desert light began to pierce the narrow lobby windows, Mrs. Vane appeared. She simply was standing at the bottom of the main staircase, silent and definitive. She surveyed the residue on the floor, the open circuit breaker panel in the back, and the key to room 12 still resting innocently on the desk. "An eventful shift, Mr. Elias," she stated. Her voice held no inflection of anger, only the chilling observation of a fault in the system. Elias straightened, meeting her gaze, his own eyes now cold and devoid of the easy fear Vane was accustomed to harvesting. "A power fluctuation," Elias lied smoothly. "The desert systems are old. I managed to stabilize the power grid and prevent a total shutdown. Rule 3 was adhered to. I remained at the desk until 6 a.m. Vane stepped closer. "Silas Croft, your predecessor, showed a similar initiative. He tried to fix the lodge, rather than serve it. Curiosity, Mr. Elias, is what the lodge digests best. Silas failed because he saw the rules as a prison to be breached," Elias countered, his voice steady. "I have learned that the rules are merely predictable patterns. They are the circulatory system of the lodge. I didn't attempt to breach the wall, I manipulated the flow." The early acceleration of Rule 1 indicated a critical buildup. The temporary shutdown ensured that the lodge's primary systems, sanitation and perimeter security, did not overload themselves and expose the interior workings to external observers. He paused, letting the implication hang. "I protected the lodge from its own predictable hunger." Vane's eyes narrowed slightly. "You chose to observe, not obey." "I chose effective compliance," Elias corrected. The lodge requires efficiency. I was inefficient for a year, simply following the letter of the law. Last night, I followed the spirit of the lodge, self-preservation through calculated pattern maintenance. Vane stood silent for a long moment, assessing the new caretaker. Elias was a strategist who understood the lodge's vulnerable predictability. You have proven yourself a reliable, if unorthodox, element, Vane concluded. We require silence and predictability, Mr. Elias. Do not mistake operational necessity for permission to wander. Understand my function, Elias confirmed. I am the custodian of the pattern. Vane finally turned away, disappearing back up the staircase. The coldness receded, and the lodge seemed to settle. Elias knew he had earned a temporary reprieve, and a seat at a different table of dread. He was now unnecessary complexity within the simple, deadly system. Elias retrieved the original, brittle parchment detailing the 5 rules. He flattened it carefully on the desk.